Driverless tube trains are an eternally controversial subject, or at least they are if my comment section is anything to go by. I've talked about where we are at the moment with tube trains that drive themselves, but I think I'd like to talk about their history. Now, before we properly begin, we do need to differentiate between automatic trains and driverless trains. Several of the London Underground lines today operate using what's known as automatic train operation. With this, many of the functions of the train are performed, well, automatically. Acceleration, braking, responding to signals. The driver still operates the doors and sets everything in motion, as well as keeping an eye on things for the sake of safety. They also have the option of manual control if required. A driverless train is one where everything is done automatically, like on the Docklands Light Railway, although the DLR can operate with drivers if needed, again. Having made the distinction between automatic trains and driverless ones, I will be shamelessly overlapping between the two throughout this video, monster that I am. Automation certainly has its positives. It eliminates a lot of human error. It saves money. These factors mean that it's always been something that train operators have been fans of. I mean, of course, it has its downsides, and ironing those out is the main reason we don't just have driverless trains everywhere. But still, reduction of staff is something that every big company likes, so it's something they've done wherever possible. For instance, in the early days of deep-level tube trains, every carriage had a gateman whose job was to let people on and off the trains. The introduction of sliding doors operated by the guard in the 1920s eliminated those staff. The first driverless underground trains in London were not actually on the capital U Underground, but on the Post Office Railway. They were operated much like a train set, with an operator controlling the voltage from the trackside. In the stations, the track voltage dropped from 440 volts to 150 volts, causing the trains to automatically halt. It was a system that worked well up until the railway was closed. But mailbags aren't the same as people, so I'm told, so automating passenger trains is a little more complicated. An engineer named Robert Dell applied himself to the problem in the 1950s. Dell had done a lot of work for London Transport in the field of signalling, in particular in automation. It was a natural extension of his previous work to move on to trains. London Transport were interested. So too were Westinghouse, manufacturers of signalling equipment, among other things. It should be pointed out that the Underground wasn't the first passenger-carrying subway system to be considered for automation, and the Times Square shuttle in New York did get there first. In fact, many of the ideas that Dell would apply were taken from American railroads. The essence of it was high-frequency audio pulses emitted from the track. The idea was that when a train passed over a section of track it would complete a circuit, which would cause the automatic signal to transmit a pulse, which would trigger controls on the train. There would be two separate systems, one to drive and one to take over in the event that anything went wrong. Dell also envisaged that drivers should still be employed, both because it would take a while to automate the entire system, and because they offered another line of protection in the event of emergency. A test train was created using a set of R stock. It was tested on what's now the Piccadilly line between Northfields and Acton Town. Dell was confident in his new system. Too confident. On the first test run, the train wouldn't start. Then it started, but backwards. Then it started forwards, but the brakes wouldn't apply. Let's just say that it was a process of trial and error. However, clearly Dell was doing something right because management approved his new system for use on the Victoria line, which was then still in the planning stages. It was a good place to introduce the system. The Victoria line was the first completely new tube line since 1907, so they could start from scratch rather than work with the idiosyncrasies of an existing railway. But this did give Dell and his team a sense of urgency, because it would be horribly embarrassing if the Victoria line opened and, say, the train started running in the wrong direction. Still, they prepared to unveil their system to the public. The system's first public test was on the District line between Ealing Broadway and Mansion House. The actual automated section was between Stamford Brook and Ravenscourt Park. The Daily Mirror announced it with the somewhat sensationalist headline, "Robot Drives Tube," which made it sound a lot cooler than it actually was. The tests were, on the whole, a success. The next test bed was the Hainault loop on the Central line. This was fairly isolated from the rest of the network. This time the train used was 1960 stock. There were a lot of teething troubles here, not least the fact that the automatic signalling couldn't figure out how to handle leaves on the line. Their solution to this was to say, forget it, on the grounds that the Victoria line is completely underground, where there are few, if any, trees. And now the problems were mostly figured out, they could turn their attention to the Victoria line. Westinghouse, who again were installing the signalling, found Dell difficult to work with. Not least because he was in the habit of not specifying what he wanted. His somewhat bizarre theory was that if he didn't, he'd keep Westinghouse guessing, and they'd be forced to over-engineer. In fact, the opposite happened, and systems would fail because they didn't know what they were supposed to do with them. Other problems arose. Emergency brakes would apply for no apparent reason. Sometimes brakes wouldn't apply until after the train had passed through a station. Damp leaking into the tunnels would trip circuits by mistake. Problems were worked through as they arose, but there was no time to do a really thorough job. Several problems were simply dismissed, like the leaves on the line issue, as something we don't have to worry about here and now. By the time the line opened in 1969, there were still problems with overrunning stations and unnecessary stops. Nevertheless, the system worked, on the whole. The train operators on the new line received a higher rate of pay than those on conventional trains, which of course made positions on the Victoria line rather sought after. These days, semi-automated trains operate not only on the Victoria line, but also the Northern, Central, Jubilee, District, Circle, Hammersmith and City and Metropolitan lines. The Bakerloo, Waterloo and City and Piccadilly lines are expected to follow once the new Tube for London trains are introduced. It's also in place on the Thameslink and Elizabeth line core sections. And of course, let's not forget the DLR's driverless operation. So, all in all, it appears that despite the best efforts of John Connor, the robots have taken over. Well, I hope you enjoyed this fully automated tale from the Tube. If you did, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I'd like to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon and here on YouTube for your always generous support. You are the signal to my relay. Or possibly vice versa. Anyway, I will see you all again very soon for another Tale from the Tube.